Hello, viewers. This is Qamar Cheema, and today's episode of this YouTube show is in English. Normally, you hear us in Urdu, but we have a friend. We have a friend from Washington, Mr. Michael Kugelman, who is kind enough to spare a few moments to make us understand that how the Biden administration is looking its Indo-Pacific policy, how India is being mainstreamed, and how the Quad is a new institutional through a new institutional framework. United States is making new alliances, and why the American administration believes that we should not sanction India under CARSA, although they have got S-400. So there are so many questions which I really wanted to dig in from Mr. Michael Kugelman so that our viewers could see here. Thank you very much, Michael, for sparing the time, please.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be back on your show with you.
Thank you. So, Michael, my first question to you is that, and that is direct question. What stopped the administration in Washington not to sanction India when they are getting S-400 from Russia? At the same time, the Americans are putting sanctions against Turkey if they're going to get S-400. So, how do you see this double standard, and what justification the people at the Capitol Hill or the State Department or the Pentagon and the White House give?
Yeah, well, the literal answer to your question as to why the U.S. has not sanctioned India for its for the S-400 deal is that the deal has not yet been 100% completed. Only when the actual equipment, when the missile defense system has been transferred to India, only then does a decision have to be made about whether sanctions are made or not. So that's why we haven't had a decision yet. But clearly, that time is coming. I think that you're already seeing some elements of the package coming into India, and it will be completed soon. And India is not backing out. That's very clear. It is going forward with this. So that brings us to the question of what then. Indeed, I think you could argue that there is, I guess, a double standard at play, and that the U.S. did sanction Turkey. It's unlikely to sanction India. I think that's very much the case. Now, the reason for that is that the U.S.-India relationship has made such progress in recent years, and there's such strong support in Washington on bipartisan levels for building and deepening the security relationship with India. And U.S. officials know that if the U.S. were actually to sanction India, that would undo just about all of the progress that's been made over the last 2 decades in U.S.-India relations at the worst possible time, in the sense that the U.S. has never seen India as more critical from a strategic level, because of this view that India can work with the U.S. to help counter the rise in power of China. Now, it's not the Biden administration itself, it's not the White House technically that makes the decision. It's the Congress, because the CATSA legislation that governs this issue of sanctioning states that acquire material from Russia, the decision has to be made on Capitol Hill. Based on what I've heard to this point, it doesn't seem that anyone on Capitol Hill has concluded that the U.S. has to sanction India, and that there can be a waiver that comes out, which is essentially a way around the conundrum. A waiver is not the same thing as saying, well, no, we're not sanctioning India. A waiver is different. And so I think that we can expect, and some reportage has already indicated this will be the case, that the U.S. will provide a presidential waiver to India, which essentially says that the sanctions aren't going to come. But the bigger question is what happens beyond that. I mean, India continues to look at Russia as a key arms supplier, and not just because of the S-400 deal. And the administration is not going to give a blanket waiver to India to allow it to continue to trade in defense with Russia. So I think that some difficult questions will have to be answered down the road. Final answer to your question, why sanction Turkey but not India? Well, I think Turkey is a NATO partner of the U.S., but Turkey really, the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey is nowhere near as warm and strong as the U.S. relationship with India is. I think at this point in time, the U.S. views India as a much more important player strategically than it does Turkey, just because of the China factor. Turkey has actually been moving closer to China. So I think that's it. All comes down to politics, right? It all comes down to interests. That there's always going to be inconsistency, double standards in how the U.S. addresses these questions. So bottom line answer to your question is we will likely see a waiver. provided to India for the S-400, but it's not going to solve the broader problem about how do you deal with a close partner that continues to trade with Russia, a key rival of the United States.
Hmm. That's great. So another question that just I really wanted you should answer it, that is that if India is the partner of the United States, for example, in quadrilateral security dialogue in Quad, we're seeing that India is not letting Quad to be a military alliance. We are hearing that yes, India, Europe is ignoring Middle East. Europe is ignoring, America is ignoring Middle East and Europe, and they are paying attention towards Indo-Pacific. And in Indo-Pacific, India is not going to be a strong military arm of the America. So they have to go for the AUKUS, Australia, US, UK. So how far this strategic autonomy, which India is keeping, is being seen in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I mean, there's long been this disconnect between the U.S. and India as to what a strong security partnership should look like. The U.S. favors the idea of a traditional alliance, as it sees it, in which India would have a relationship with the U.S. similar to what the NATO countries would have with the U.S. or what treaty allies like Japan and South Korea would have with the U.S. One that entails not just a lot of not just arms trade and cooperation on transferring and sharing defense technology, but also actual operational cooperation that could potentially include being willing to fight alongside each other in a conflict. Now, this is not what India is interested in. And strategic autonomy continues to be the operative policy for New Delhi. Certainly, the Modi government has moved closer to the U.S. than any previous Indian government has. And we've seen that with all of these key defense agreements, these so-called foundational agreements that allow the Indian and U.S. militaries to work more closely together. That's all been concluded. So the two sides have come very far. And you're going to see situations now where the U.S. can actually use Indian military equipment and facilities, such as the ability to have its ships, its naval ships, use Indian refueling stations at sea. This is a type of thing that had not been in place until relatively recently. But India continues to avoid the word ally. It still doesn't like that word, and so I think this certainly raises a question for the future. The more the U.S.-India relationship strengthens, the more tricky that question gets as to how to build out a deep security partnership that is outside of the alliance system that the U.S. prefers for its allies and partners. And indeed, the Quad is a way around that conundrum in the sense that it's not an alliance. It is a security grouping to an extent, in the sense that the four Quad countries, they agree to engage in training, military training exercises, that type of thing. That's been happening for some time, but it is projected as a grouping that emphasizes non-security issues more. I mean, the top priorities of the Quad, as reflected in the various working groups, they relate to things like emerging technologies, climate change, public health. It's all about countering China at the end of the day. But indeed, it's not as explicitly branded as a security grouping as had been the case previously. And the formal title of this thing is the Quadrilateral Security Group. But now the four countries don't use that anymore. They say Quad. So even rhetorically, you see this effort to, I think, de-emphasize the security aspects of the group. But that's not just to appease Indian concerns. I think it's also in order to reduce the opportunity that China itself would be provoked. Now, China certainly views the Quad as an alliance, and it sees it as an effort to contain China, and that's what China's allies believe as well. But indeed, the four Quad countries have been very careful about de-emphasizing the idea of security. But make no mistake, there are security elements to the Quad, but it entails, it's relatively modest. It entails joint exercises and technology transfers and that type of thing. And that clearly is something that will be more comfortable arrangement for India.
Okay. So the next question, Mr. Michael, which I want to ask you about, America has long been talking that, and whenever they had to screw someone, they used to screw from this humanitarian lens, human rights issue, media freedom, freedom of expression. But what we have been hearing and how we have been realizing that, for example, Americans put India as a country of particular concern in the last year, but this time they have not put it because there was a special the pressure that came from India, and America had to backtrack. On the same way, the same wavelength, we understand that when the Americans asked the Chinese about their human rights record, the Chinese came up with a further tough tone. For example, the first interaction with the Secretary Antony Blinken, which happened in Alaska, the Chinese came up with a very tough tone, Visa. So, how do you see that this America is using this issue of human rights? Is not that isn't that much being valued in China and India. So, do you think America is finding difficulties in engaging and talking with these countries, particularly powerful countries, on which America is compete on with whom America is competing and dependent on?
Yeah, it's a tough issue. One of the many similarities between India and China is that they are both very sensitive to the notion of other countries commenting on and especially criticizing their internal politics. So, neither India nor China like it when the U.S. government makes judgments about the quality or the type of political system inside China and India. I mean, we've seen that again and again. I mean, every time you've had, even though it's been relatively modest and subtle, when you've had criticism, U.S. criticism of human rights violations in India and its actions in Kashmir, when there's been that criticism, India reacts very strongly. And whenever you have these new rankings that come out from Freedom House or other groups that rank countries in terms of democracy, India is never happy with that, and India, I believe, has actually claimed that it would want to come out with its own democracy rankings because it thinks that the U.S. doesn't do them well. So this is certainly a challenge. But here again, everything is about realpolitik. Everything is about interests. So the Biden administration came to office saying that it would be elevating democracy and human rights to a top priority for its U.S. foreign policy, meaning that U.S. foreign policy will use human rights and democracy promotion as a main pillar of that foreign policy. But it's had a very mixed record so far. It has wasted no opportunity to excoriate China for its human rights record, for its treatment of the Uyghurs, and so on. But with India, it's been very different. And I would argue that the Biden administration has been just as, if not more quiet than the Trump administration when it comes to criticism of India's human rights record, which is saying something because the Trump administration was the least, if you think about democracy promotion administrations, the Trump administration could care less about that. And yet one could argue that you heard more noise from the Trump administration about concerns about democracy in India than you did from the Biden administration. Again, even in the Trump administration, it was very subtle. So you're always going to have this conversation when you have a high level engagement. When you had the summit between Biden and Modi some weeks back. When you have these 2+2 groupings where the foreign and the defense ministers meet, there's always going to be a lot of commentary and speculation about, well, will the U.S. bring up the democracy issue? Will it bring up the human rights concerns in India? Will it bring up concerns about Modi's policies? And I think basically what you're going to see is, privately, quietly, the issues brought up sometimes. When Secretary of State Blinken was in India some months ago, he met with a group of civil society personnel. And in some introductory comments, he very gently brought attention to concerns about rights, but it's not more than that. And we all know why, right? India is a strategic partner, and the U.S. is going to go easy on its strategic partners. It's not going to criticize them. It's going to be much more critical of the human rights records of U.S. rivals like China or those countries that the U.S. does not deem to be terribly strategically significant, such as some of the countries in Africa that the Biden administration has been very critical of. Burma is another example. The Biden administration has been very, very critical of the army, the Myanmar military's activities. But you're not going to get that with India because India is a different story.
Okay, so there are two more questions for you. The one question is about Europe and Middle East. For example, this recent French president's visit to UAE, where we have seen that the Emiratis are buying some 80 Rafale of about $19 billion, and what we see is that they wanted to buy F-35, but the Americans have not shown some interest, or there were some regulations which they couldn't pass that. So the question is, do you really believe that America is moving away from Middle East and moving away from Europe and not paying much attention to the old partners? And what we really listen from the Americans is that they are trying to convince the Europeans and the Middle Eastern countries that we are still important for Middle East. Recently, Mr. Blinken was saying that America is still in Middle East. We are not leaving. So giving assurances is what we are seeing. That do you think this is legacy of the Donald Trump, or do you think that America is really looking towards to be in the China's backyard, and to be in the Indo-Pacific has become so much important that America somehow neglected Middle East and Europe?
No, I think that the Biden administration wants to be present and engaging in all of these areas, Asia as well as the Middle East and Europe. Now, the Middle East is interesting because as the U.S. energy policy has evolved in recent years, its reliance on energy sources in the Middle East has declined, and I think that makes it less necessary for it to be present or heavily engaged in the Middle East. And also, the U.S. is not, at least not now, it's not fighting any wars in the Middle East. There's not much going on, so to speak, which is a good thing, I think. So I think that the U.S. does certainly want to disengage to an extent from the Middle East, but the U.S. continues to have very significant partners in the Middle East. Israel, of course, above all else, but also other key partners like Jordan and Egypt. And the Biden administration has clearly supported the Abraham Accords, which, of course, was an effort, I would argue, a major success story of the Trump administration, in which you had Israel conclude peace deals with a number of countries in the region. And the Biden administration wants to build on that momentum. It wants to see Israel in a position to normalize relations with more countries around the region. That's something that the U.S. would support. So with the Middle East, the U.S., I think it can conclude its interests do not require it to be as present as engaged in the past, but it's not going to abandon the region, not by a long shot. As for Europe, no, that's very important for the Biden administration. One of the major objectives of this administration has been to restore alliances that it believes the Trump administration had eroded. And so many of the U.S.'s key alliances are in Europe because of the NATO countries. And so that will be a priority. Certainly there are some tensions, and I do think that the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan unfortunately added to the tensions between the U.S. and its NATO partners that had been in place since the Trump administration, when President Trump had angered just about every NATO capital. What happened in Afghanistan has not made the Biden administration's objective of bringing those relationships back together any easier. So you're going to continue to see Biden administration officials focus on Europe. Now, with Asia, I do think that we've reached a point where the U.S. is seriously committed to pivoting to Asia and the Indo-Pacific. We'd heard for so many years, going back many years, that the U.S. was going to to pivot, or pick your term, redirect, reorient to Asia, but things always popped up in elsewhere to distract U.S. attention from that redirect, from that pivot. And to an extent, that's still true, right? I mean, it's the U.S. is very concerned that Russia could be about to invade Ukraine. So I think that's just one example of how there's always going to be issues happening elsewhere that could make it difficult for the U.S. to fully train its foreign policy bandwidth on the Indo-Pacific. But there's been more progress in redirecting to Asia than there has ever been before, just because you have a clear policy, the Indo-Pacific policy, with a lot of associated tools like the U.S. or the International Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, which are all meant to support U.S. investments in the region. The Quad has new momentum now. All of this suggests that the U.S. is really serious about redirecting, and part of it is the same, is tied to the same objective with Europe, is to restore alliances. In this case, with Japan and South Korea, the U.S. certainly wants to move closer to India. So, to me, I think that we are going to see a lot more substantive results in terms of the U.S. ability to deploy more assets and capital, both economic, diplomatic, and security, to the Indo-Pacific region. But it's not going to forget about the Middle East, and it certainly will want to continue to engage with Europe and the Middle East to an extent as well, because it has key allies and partners in all of those areas, and it also has key rivals and enemies in all of those areas, especially, of course, in the Middle East and Russia and so on.
Hmm. Okay, thank you very much on this. But the last question I have from you is about Pakistan. And you might have, since you follow South Asian politics a lot, and you are one of those scholars in Washington who actually know much of the culture, language of India and Pakistan. So you follow that how in Pakistan political circles, you might have seen that there was a debate that why President Biden is not calling Imran Khan. And at the same time, this I just really want to hear your comments on that. And even every person, every media outlet which is coming to speak to Prime Minister Imran Khan, they ask him a question that why Biden is not calling you. But just answer this question. And the second thing is that how do you see this? 1 year is ending, and we have seen that the American administration have not engaged with Pakistan in a very robust way. So, how do you think that the American administration, even the State Department, Pentagon, and Washington, looking Pakistan in the post-U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that there has been some very intensive engagement with Pakistan, but it's been very narrowly focused. It's all revolved around Afghanistan. You've had a number of calls and some visits involving senior U.S. officials, not President Biden, but involving the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the CIA director, and a number of calls with counterparts in Pakistan. This has been happening. So I think that it would be inaccurate to say that there has not been intense engagement. There has been. It's just been very narrowly focused on around one issue, which of course underscores this long-standing disconnect in U.S.-Pakistan relations, where Pakistan wants the engagement to go well beyond a single issue of Afghanistan. But I think that there's not much of a stomach for that or a desire for that here in Washington. I think that it's ironic that we've heard there's been so much commentary that suggests that since the U.S. has left Afghanistan, it's going to be there's going to be a challenge for the U.S. and Pakistan to try to identify a new basis for the relationship, because the U.S. at least has looked at its relationship with Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan for so long. So now what? I would argue that here in Washington, Afghanistan will continue to be the lens through which the U.S. looks at the relationship with Pakistan, because now we're in this post-withdrawal phase and of course we're in a position where the Taliban is in control in Afghanistan. The U.S. is going to continue to look at Pakistan in a similar way as a key player that has influence and leverage over the Taliban to try to help the U.S. Achieve its goals with the Taliban, which the U.S. believes should also be Pakistan's goals with the Taliban, in terms of trying to get the Taliban to support these efforts to bring in humanitarian assistance, not to get in the way of efforts to evacuate those foreigners that want to leave, and also to try to convince the Taliban to soften its social policies, particularly toward women. And we could talk about how the U.S. may overstate the degree of Pakistani leverage over the Taliban. That may be the case, but this is how the U.S. sees Pakistan in this role. The other issue is security. The U.S. claims that it wants to develop this over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity to be able to continue to focus on counterterrorism when it's not in the country. And there's been a lot of discussion about how or if Pakistan would want to support that, not through bases. I think that's off the table. There had been a lot of talk about how that could be on the table. I don't think that's on the table. So you'd be in a better position than me to know what's being discussed in Islamabad. I think the U.S. is looking at other areas. I think it's looking for the Pakistanis to formally agree to allow the U.S. to use Pakistani airspace to conduct counterterrorism surveillance or operations or even airstrikes in Afghanistan. I think that we may see the U.S. trying to get new intelligence sharing agreements with Pakistan when it comes to tracking the movements of ISK in Afghanistan. So I think that's what this relationship, unfortunately, I think this is a bad thing. That's what this relationship will continue to revolve around, the Afghanistan issue. Now, if the U.S. were to conclude that it's hopeless to try to create this ability to wage counterterrorism from outside of Afghanistan in Afghanistan, then that I think suggests that the potential for U.S.-Pakistan relations, the relationship may start to drift. And if the U.S. decides to disengage completely from Afghanistan months from now, which could well happen, that suggests to me that the future of the relationship could be, of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship could be very uncertain. The idea of building the relationship around trade and investment, geopolitics, and all of that, that doesn't get much interest and support here in Washington, quite frankly, and especially because you have an administration that has many top officials, including Biden, who had been in the Obama administration at a very difficult moment in U.S.-Pakistan relations, and there's a lot of baggage, and they remember 2011, 2012, how bad things were. They're not easily going to forget that. So I think that the personalities in place, even though they understand Pakistan well, they know Pakistan well, they have a lot of bad memories. And I think that could make it less likely that they would be willing to broaden the scope and look back at those years of strategic dialogue with Pakistan that ended up coming to an end when the security tensions became too great. Final point, you're on the response to why Biden hasn't spoken to Imran Khan yet. I think that Biden and his administration see this relationship as a purely transactional one, and I think that he would only be ready to have a call with Imran Khan when there's some type of major achievement or an agreement to finalize, or to, for instance, if there's a new intelligence sharing agreement between the two sides focused on Afghanistan, that could be a reason for a call. I just don't see the Biden as someone who would want to have a call with Imran Khan just for the sake of having a call with him, if that makes any sense. It's such a narrowly focused transactional relationship that, this is not Donald Trump, who was happy to pick up the phone and, have a call with Nawaz Sharif and, and basically treat it like it was a business meeting. He's being a businessman and, coming off the call and saying, oh yeah, what a great guy. We had a nice chat. Biden is not interested in doing things like that. He's very focused on, getting things done. Transactional engagements are the key. So only when there's something to formalize, only when there's something to congratulate the two sides for, only then I think will we see the call. And I think it's wrong. I think that Biden should have had a call with Imran Khan, just because clearly the U.S. views Pakistan as an important player in Afghanistan, pre-withdrawal and also post-withdrawal, given the level of engagement you've had with U.S. and Pakistani officials. There's nothing wrong with having the call. It's not going to hurt President Biden politically. So I think that's a mistake to not have the call, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Hello? Hello?